regardless of how it aligned with his vision for our shared future. The bracelet caught the morning light as I reached for my phone to call Sarah Chen. Some decisions couldn't be made gradually or diplomatically. Some choices required the courage to leap before you could talk yourself out of the jump. Sarah? This is Rachel Harper. I'd like to accept your offer. The words felt like the first honest thing I'd said in years, the first choice I'd made based purely on my own sense of calling and purpose. As I spoke the details of my acceptance, I felt something I'd almost forgotten, the exhilaration of authoring my own story rather than editing someone else's. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Whatever came next would be mine to navigate, mine to celebrate, mine to regret if necessary. But it would be mine, and after 6 years of existing primarily as an extension of someone else's dreams, that felt like everything. Marcus returned from Nashville that Thursday evening, with the energy of someone who'd glimpsed a larger stage for his ambitions. He burst through our front door carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the satisfied expression of a man whose networking had exceeded expectations. The house filled with his enthusiasm as he detailed conversations with megachurch pastors, book publishers, and conference organizers who'd taken interest in his ministry approach. "You should have seen the response when I shared our growth model," he said, pacing around our living room while I prepared dinner according to his post-travel preferences. 3 different churches want to implement our small group structure, and there's serious interest in having me consult on their expansion strategies. I listened from the kitchen, noting how naturally he spoke of ownership over strategies and methods that had evolved through the contributions of dozens of staff members and volunteers over the years. In Marcus's narrative, he was the visionary architect while everyone else provided implementation support. Dr. Peterson introduced me to his literary agent, Marcus continued, his voice rising with excitement. "She thinks my leadership philosophy could be the foundation for a best-selling book about church growth in post-Christian America." The chicken I was seasoning suddenly required intense concentration as I processed the implications of what he was describing. A book deal would mean speaking tours, media appearances, consulting opportunities that would cement his reputation as a thought leader in evangelical circles. It would also mean even less of his attention focused on our actual relationship and more energy devoted to building the Marcus web brand. "That's quite an opportunity," I said carefully, not trusting myself to sound appropriately enthusiastic about plans that would expand his platform while further marginalizing my own existence. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, his smile faltering slightly as he studied my expression. "You don't seem very excited about this." "I'm processing it," I replied honestly. "It's a lot to take in." He moved closer, reaching for my hands in a gesture that had once felt comforting, but now seemed calculated to regain my attention and approval. "Rachel, this could change everything for us. National influence, financial security, the ability to impact thousands of churches across the country. Isn't this what we've been working toward?" The question hung between us, loaded with assumptions about shared goals and unified vision. When had we discussed working toward national influence? When had I agreed that my life's purpose was advancing his platform? The "we" in his statement felt like linguistic sleight of hand, creating the illusion of partnership in decisions I'd never been asked to make. What about what I want? The words escaped before I could consider their impact. Marcus's expression shifted from enthusiasm to confusion, as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "What do you mean?" "I mean that all of this expansion, this platform building, this national influence, when did we discuss whether that's what I wanted for our life?" He released my hands and stepped back, his Confederate memorial windows and guest list heavy on Virginia society matrons. I had gently but firmly insisted on a military ceremony at the base chapel, honoring the tradition that meant something to both James and me. Victoria had acquiesced, but not without making it clear that she viewed this as the first of many compromises she would have to endure. When Sophia was born, Victoria's disapproval took on new dimensions. She criticized everything from the name we chose, apparently Sophia wasn't traditional enough, to the way I insisted on breastfeeding rather than using formula. She made pointed comments about how military wives in her day understood the importance of maintaining their figures and social obligations. Most telling was her reaction when I showed her the christening gown for the first time. "How quaint," she had said, fingering the delicate fabric with something approaching disdain. Of course, the sterling christening gown is much more elaborate. It was designed by Worth in Paris and has been featured in Southern Living twice. Perhaps we could have little Sophia photographed in both gowns for comparison. I had smiled politely and explained that using my family's gown wasn't negotiable. It represented a legacy of service and sacrifice that I wanted Sophia to understand from her earliest moments. Victoria had nodded, but her eyes had narrowed in that particular way that I was beginning to recognize as dangerous. The weeks leading up to the christening had been tense. Victoria inserted herself into every decision, from the flower arrangements to the menu for the reception. She questioned my choice of godparents, Captain Ryan Sterling, James's younger brother, and my childhood friend Lisa Thompson, now a sergeant stationed at Fort Bragg. Victoria felt that Lisa's rank wasn't appropriate for such an important role, conveniently ignoring the fact that Lisa had saved 3 lives during her deployment in Afghanistan and carried a Silver Star to prove it. James tried to keep the peace, as he always did when it came to his mother. He loved her despite her flaws, and I understood that. Victoria had raised him and Ryan as a single mother after their father died in a training accident when James was 12. She had sacrificed to ensure they had every advantage, and James felt a deep sense of loyalty because of it. But loyalty, I was learning, could become a weapon when wielded by someone who confused love with control. The morning of the christening, I had planned to spend quietly preparing. I wanted to feed Sophia one last time before dressing her in the gown, then take a few moments to reflect on the significance of the day. The chapel service would be simple but meaningful, with Chaplain Father Martinez performing the ceremony. Father Martinez had baptized dozens of military children and understood the unique challenges and blessings of raising a family in service to the country. I was in the kitchen preparing Sophia's bottle when I heard the front door open. James wouldn't be back for another hour, so I assumed it was Lisa arriving early to help with last-minute preparations. Instead, I heard the distinctive click of Victoria's heels against the hardwood floor. "Natalie, dear," Victoria called out, her voice carrying that particular sweetness that always put me on edge. "I hope you don't mind me letting myself in. I wanted to check on a few things before the service." I walked to the living room still holding Sophia's bottle and found Victoria already heading toward the nursery. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in a navy blue dress with pearls that probably cost more than my car. Her silver hair was styled in the elaborate updo she favored for important occasions, and her makeup was flawless despite the early hour. "Of course," I replied, following her down the hall. "Is there something specific you needed to check?" "Oh, just the usual pre-event details," she said airily, pushing open the nursery door. "You know how important it is that everything be perfect for such a significant day." I watched as Victoria moved around the room, straightening items that didn't need straightening and examining details with the intensity of a military inspector. She paused at the armoire where the christening gown hung, her fingers hovering over the tissue paper. "You know, dear," she said without looking at me, "I've been thinking about today's ceremony, and I'm concerned about the impression we'll make." "What do you mean?" I asked, though something in her tone was already setting off alarm bells in my mind. Victoria turned to face me, and for the first time I saw something cold and calculating in her expression that went beyond her usual disapproval. "This gown," she said, gesturing toward the armoire, "while I'm sure it has sentimental value, isn't really appropriate for the Sterling family's first christening. People will be watching, Natalie. Important people. The base commander will be there, along with several other high-ranking officers and their wives. We need to present the right image." I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level. "Victoria, we've discussed this. The gown represents my family's military heritage. It's important to me that Sophia wear it." "Your family's heritage," Victoria repeated, and there was no mistaking the dismissive tone now. "Dear, let's be honest about what we're dealing with here. Your great-grandmother was a nurse, not an officer's wife. Your grandmother was married to an enlisted man. These are very different social circles. and the gown reflects that difference. The insult hung in the air between us like smoke from a battlefield. Victoria had just dismissed 3 generations of my family's service as somehow lesser because they hadn't held the right ranks or moved in the right social circles. She had reduced my great-grandmother's courage in treating wounded soldiers under fire to a matter of social status. "I understand you're proud of your family," Victoria continued, her voice taking on a patronizing quality that made my skin crawl. "But now you're part of the Sterling family, and we have certain standards to maintain. I've brought the Sterling christening gown with me. It's in the car, properly preserved and ready for use. I think you'll find it much more suitable for today's audience." I stared at her for a long moment, processing what she was really asking me to do. She wanted me to abandon my family's tradition for the sake of her image. She wanted me to tell my daughter someday that her great-great-grandmother's courage and sacrifice weren't good enough for the Sterling family standards. "No," I said quietly. Victoria blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct refusal. "I'm sorry?" I said, "No, Victoria, Sophia will wear my family's gown today. That's not negotiable." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Victoria's carefully composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. "I see," she said, her voice crisp with authority. "Well, I suppose we'll have to agree to disagree. I'll just go get the Sterling gown from the car so we have options." Victoria left the nursery, and I heard her heels clicking purposefully toward the front door. I should have followed her. I should have locked the door behind her and called James immediately. Instead, I went to check on Sophia, who had started making the soft mewing sounds that meant she was waking up hungry. I was in the middle of changing Sophia's diaper when I heard Victoria return. She moved through the house with unusual speed, her heels creating a staccato rhythm that seemed almost urgent. I finished with Sophia and was about to head back to the living room when I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, the distinctive snip of scissors cutting through fabric. I ran to the nursery, Sophia still in my arms, and found Victoria standing over the bassinet with a pair of fabric scissors in her hand. The christening gown lay in pieces on the floor, the ivory silk cut into irregular strips, the hand-sewn pearls scattered like tears across the hardwood. Victoria looked up at me with cold satisfaction, her mask completely gone now. "Now we can finally get her something appropriate for our family," she said, her voice steady and completely without remorse. I stared at the destruction, feeling something break inside.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
My chest that had nothing to do with fabric or pearls. She had destroyed something irreplaceable, something that connected Sophia to generations of strong women who had served their country with honor. She had cut through history itself, reducing courage and sacrifice to ribbons on the floor. "You destroyed it," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I improved the situation," Victoria corrected, setting the scissors down on the changing table with deliberate precision. "Now we can focus on what's truly important, presenting the right image for the Sterling family." The sound of car doors slamming in the driveway broke through the surreal horror of the moment. James was home early, and from the sound of multiple doors, he wasn't alone. I heard voices outside, including one I recognized as Captain Ryan Sterling, James's brother who was serving as godfather. Victoria heard them too, and for the first time since I'd entered the nursery, she looked uncertain. "Now, Natalie," she said, her voice taking on a placating tone, "let's not make a scene. We can explain this calmly. I've brought a beautiful gown that will photograph much better. Everyone will understand that we had to make a practical decision." I looked down at Sophia in my arms, then at the destroyed gown on the floor, then back at Victoria's expectant face. She actually believed that I would go along with this. She thought that her destruction of something sacred to my family could be passed off as a practical decision that everyone would accept. The front door opened, and I heard James calling out, "Natalie, we're back early." Ryan brought Lisa with him from the airport. I walked to the nursery door, still holding Sophia, and called back in a voice that sounded surprisingly steady, "We're in the nursery. you need to see this." Footsteps approached quickly, and James appeared in the doorway, still in his dress uniform from the Pentagon meeting. His eyes took in the scene immediately. Victoria standing by the bassinet with scissors still visible on the changing table, the destroyed gown on the floor, and me holding our daughter with an expression he'd never seen before. "What happened here?" James asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of military command. "There was a little accident," Victoria began, but I cut her off. "Your mother cut up Sophia's christening gown," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "The gown that belonged to my great-grandmother. She destroyed it because she didn't think it was appropriate for the Sterling family image." Ryan appeared behind James, followed by Lisa, both of them still in travel clothes. Ryan's eyes widened as he took in the destruction, while Lisa's face hardened into the expression I remembered from our military training days. James stepped into the room, his gaze moving from the scattered pieces of silk and pearls to his mother's face. When he spoke, his voice carried a tone I'd never heard him use with Victoria before. "Mom, tell me you didn't do this." Victoria straightened, clearly expecting James to take her side as he had so many times before. "James, darling, I was simply trying to prevent embarrassment. That old gown wasn't suitable for such an important occasion. I brought the Sterling family gown, which is much more appropriate." "You destroyed my wife's family heirloom," James said, each word crisp and precise, "because you thought it wasn't good enough for our family." "I made a practical decision," Victoria replied, but for the first time, her voice wavered slightly. "People would have talked, James. Important people. Your career. My career." James interrupted, and now there was steel in his voice that I recognized from the few times I'd heard him address subordinates who had seriously disappointed him. "You think my career depends on what christening gown my daughter wears?" Ryan stepped forward, his face pale as he looked at the destroyed gown. "Mom, this is wrong. Even for you, this is wrong." "Don't you start," Victoria snapped at her younger son. "You're too young to understand the complexities of military social dynamics." Lisa, who had been silent until now, let out a short laugh that held no humor. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I've been in the military for 8 years. I understand military social dynamics just fine. And what you've done here isn't about military tradition. It's about cruelty." Victoria's face flushed red. "I don't need to be lectured by someone of your rank about family matters." The words hung in the air like a physical slap. Lisa had earned her sergeant's stripes through merit and courage, and Victoria had just dismissed her based purely on rank and social status. It was the same thinking that had led her to destroy the christening gown. The belief that some people and some traditions simply weren't good enough for the Sterling family. James's expression changed completely. The disappointment was still there, but now it was joined by something colder and more dangerous. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Ryan, take Lisa and show her the guest room so she can get settled. Natalie, why don't you take Sophia to our bedroom and get her ready for her bottle? I need to make some phone calls." "James," Victoria began, but he held up a hand that brooked no argument. "Mom, you need to leave. Now. We'll discuss this later, but right now, you need to go." "I'm not leaving," Victoria said, drawing herself up to her full height. "I'm the hostess for the reception. People are expecting me to—" "The reception is canceled," James said flatly. "And if you don't leave voluntarily, I'll have base security escort you off the premises." Victoria stared at him, clearly shocked that he was finally standing up to her. "You wouldn't dare." James pulled out his phone and started dialing. "Colonel Hayes? It's James Brooks. I need a favor." Victoria's face went white. Colonel Patricia Hayes was James's immediate superior at the Pentagon, and one of the most respected officers in the entire military hierarchy. She was also known for having zero tolerance for behavior that reflected poorly on military families. On second thought, Victoria said quickly, "Perhaps I should give you some time to calm down. We can discuss this rationally later." She gathered her purse and headed for the door, but stopped when James called after her. "Mom, leave your key to our quarters on the table." You won't be needing it anymore." Victoria's face crumpled for just a moment, the reality of what she had done and what it was going to cost her finally sinking in. But instead of apologizing, instead of showing any remorse for destroying something irreplaceable, she lifted her chin defiantly. "You'll regret this, James. When you realize what I was trying to protect you from, you'll regret this." She left the key on the hall table and walked out, the sound of her heels gradually fading as she made her way to her car. We listened in silence as the engine started and she drove away. James closed his phone without completing the call to Colonel Hayes, but I noticed he didn't put it away entirely. He came over to where I stood holding Sophia and gently touched the baby's cheek with one finger. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry she did this." I looked down at our daughter, who was blissfully unaware of the drama surrounding her christening day, then back at the scattered remains of the gown on the floor. The silk was beyond repair, the pearls would never be properly restrung, and the history that connected Sophia to her great-great-grandmother was gone forever. But as I watched James carefully gathering the pieces, his dress uniform crisp, and his face set with a determination I'd rarely seen, I realized that Victoria had made a crucial miscalculation. She had assumed that destroying my family's tradition would force me to accept hers. Instead, she had shown James exactly who she really was beneath the carefully maintained facade of family loyalty and social propriety. And James, I was beginning to realize, was not the kind of man who tolerated attacks on his family. Not even from his own mother. The christening would go on, but it would be very different from what anyone had planned. And Victoria Sterling was about to learn what happened when you declared war on a Pentagon general's family. The hours that followed Victoria's departure felt suspended in time, like the quiet moments before a storm breaks fully open. James had disappeared into his study immediately after his mother left, and through the closed door I could hear the low murmur of phone conversations that carried the weight of serious business. Ryan and Lisa had taken over the practical matters, quietly canceling the reception venue and notifying the handful of guests who had been invited to the chapel service. Sophia remained blissfully unaware of the chaos surrounding her christening day, content to nurse and sleep, while the adults around her dealt with the wreckage of family relationships. I found myself grateful for her innocent presence, the way her small fingers would curl around mine, providing an anchor to what truly mattered amid the emotional devastation Victoria had unleashed. Lisa sat with me in the living room while I fed Sophia, her presence both comforting and familiar. We had served together during our early years in the military, and she had seen me through some of the most challenging moments of my career. Her silver star wasn't just decoration. It represented the night she had crawled through enemy fire to drag 3 wounded soldiers to safety during an ambush in Afghanistan. Victoria's dismissive comment about her rank had revealed more about Victoria's character than any amount of social posturing ever could. "You know," Lisa said quietly, watching Sophia's tiny hand rest against my arm, "in all my years of service, I've never seen anything quite like what she did in there. I've seen people do terrible things under extreme stress, in combat situations where fear makes you act without thinking. But that wasn't fear or stress. That was calculated cruelty." I shifted Sophia to my shoulder, gently patting her back until she released a small burp that made us both smile despite the circumstances. "She's been building up to this for months," I admitted. Little comments, small criticisms, ways of making me feel like I didn't belong in the Sterling family. But I never thought she'd go this far. "The gown represented something she couldn't control," Lisa observed. "Your family's legacy, your connection to military tradition that had nothing to do with her influence. She had to destroy it because she couldn't claim it." Through the study door, James's voice rose slightly, though the words remained indistinct. Whatever conversations he was having were clearly intense, and I found myself both curious and apprehensive about what he might be planning. The James I knew was methodical and strategic, qualities that had served him well in his rise through the military ranks. When he set his mind to addressing a problem, he did so with the thoroughness of a military operation. Ryan emerged from the nursery carrying a small dustpan filled with silk fragments and scattered pearls. His face was grim as he set it carefully on the coffee table, and I could see him struggling with conflicting loyalties. Victoria was his mother, the woman who had sacrificed to raise him after their father's death, but what she had done was indefensible by any standard of decency. "I've gathered all the pieces I could find," he said quietly. "Maybe a textile conservator could do something with them, create some kind of memorial piece or shadow box. It wouldn't be the same as the original gown, but it might preserve some of the history." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to my eyes. Ryan had always been the gentler of the two Sterling sons, more prone to seeking peaceful solutions than confrontation. His suggestion showed that he understood the true value of what his mother had destroyed, beyond the mere fabric and embellishment. "Thank you," I managed to say. "That means more than you know." The study door opened, and James emerged looking like a man who had just completed a particularly complex briefing. His expression was composed but intense, and I recognized the focused energy that meant he had moved from emotional response to strategic planning. "The christening will proceed as scheduled," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of command. "Father Martinez has been informed of the change in circumstances, and he's prepared to adapt the ceremony accordingly. We'll use the simple white gown that Sophia wore home from the hospital. It's not a family heirloom, but it's what we have." "What about Mom?" Ryan asked carefully. James's expression hardened slightly. "Mother has made her choice. She's not welcome at the ceremony or any future family events until she demonstrates genuine remorse for what she's done and takes concrete steps to make amends." "James," I said softly, "I don't want you to cut off your relationship with your mother because of me. She's your family, and despite everything, I know you love her." He came over and sat beside me, reaching out to stroke Sophia's downy hair with gentle fingers. "You and Sophia are my family now, Natalie. My first responsibility is to protect you and our daughter. What Mom did today wasn't just an attack on a piece of clothing. It was an attack on your heritage, your family's service record, and ultimately on you as a person. I won't tolerate that from anyone, including her." The conviction in his voice was absolute, and I realized that Victoria's actions had accomplished something she never intended. Instead of driving a wedge between James and me, she had forced him to choose sides definitively, and he had chosen his wife and daughter over his mother's toxic behavior. "There's something else," James continued, his tone shifting to one I recognized from his professional briefings. "I've been in contact with some colleagues about Victoria's behavior pattern. What she did today wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It's part of a consistent pattern of manipulation and control that needs to be addressed comprehensively." Lisa leaned forward, her military training evident in the sharp attention she gave to James's words. "What kind of pattern?" James was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "After Dad died, Mom became obsessed with maintaining what she saw as the family's social position. She spent the last 15 years systematically alienating anyone who didn't meet her standards of acceptability. Friends, extended family, even some of Ryan's previous girlfriends have been subjected to similar treatment." Ryan's face went pale. "You're talking about Michelle." "Among others," James confirmed grimly. "I've made some calls this afternoon to people I should have contacted years ago. The pattern is consistent and escalating. I thought about Michelle, Ryan's college girlfriend who had disappeared from family gatherings abruptly during their senior year. Ryan had been devastated, claiming she had ended things without explanation. At the time, I had assumed it was typical college relationship drama, but now I wondered what role Victoria might have played in that breakup. "What exactly did you find out?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. James exchanged a look with Ryan before continuing. "Mom has been using her social connections and financial resources to interfere in family members' relationships for years. She researches people's backgrounds, looks for vulnerabilities, and then applies pressure, through various channels, to remove what she sees as undesirable influences." The implications of what he was saying began to sink in. Victoria hadn't just been a difficult mother-in-law, she had been actively working to sabotage relationships that didn't meet her approval. "With Michelle," Ryan said slowly as understanding dawned on his face, "Mom offered to pay for her graduate school tuition, but only if she relocated to a different state. She said it would be better for both of us to experience other relationships before making long-term commitments. And Michelle took the offer? Lisa asked. Ryan nodded miserably. She said she couldn't pass up a full ride to graduate school, but that we could try to maintain a long-distance relationship. Of course, it fell apart within months. I never understood why she was so eager to leave until now. The cruelty of Victoria's manipulation was breathtaking in its way. Calculated precision. She had identified what Michelle valued most, education and financial security, and used it as leverage to break up her son's relationship. And she had done it in a way that made Michelle appear to be the one making the choice, protecting herself from Ryan's anger while achieving her desired outcome. How many others? I asked quietly. At least 3 that I've been able to confirm so far, James replied. And those are just the romantic relationships. I suspect there have been friendships and professional connections that have been damaged as well. The scope of Victoria's interference was staggering. She had spent years systematically isolating her sons from anyone who might challenge her influence or fail to meet her standards of social acceptability. It was emotional manipulation on a scale that bordered on pathological. "Why are you telling us this now?" Ryan asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. "Because what happened today represents an escalation," James said bluntly. Before, Mom's manipulations were subtle, designed to create distance gradually. Destroying the christening gown was different. It was direct, destructive, and irreversible. It tells me that she's willing to go to much greater lengths to maintain control. I felt a chill run down my spine as the full implications of James's assessment sank in. Victoria hadn't just had a moment of poor judgment or family conflict. She had escalated to active destruction of irreplaceable family property. What would she be willing to do next if she felt her position was threatened further? "What are you planning to do?" I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to know the answer. James's expression shifted into what I privately called his command mode, the focused intensity he brought to complex military operations. "I'm implementing what we call a comprehensive containment strategy. Mom's ability to interfere in family matters needs to be restricted, and there need to be consequences for her past actions." "That sounds very official," Lisa observed. "It is official," James replied. "One of the calls I made this afternoon was to Colonel Hayes. I've requested a formal review of Mom's access to military social functions and base facilities. Her behavior today violated several regulations regarding conduct that reflects poorly on military families. The idea that Victoria's actions could have official military consequences hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. As the wife of a deceased military officer and mother of 2 active duty officers, Victoria held a position within the military community that came with certain expectations and responsibilities. "Can they actually restrict her access?" Ryan asked. "They can and they will," James confirmed. Colonel Hayes was very interested to learn about Mom's pattern of behavior, particularly the way she's used her connections within the military wives' social network to gather information about people's backgrounds and apply pressure in personal relationships. I thought about the various military social events I had attended with Victoria, the way she seemed to know intimate details about other families' business, and how she had subtly probed for information about my own background during our early meetings. What I had attributed to normal social curiosity now seemed much more calculating and invasive. "There's more," James continued. "I've also contacted the venue where the reception was supposed to be held. When I explained the circumstances of the cancellation, they were very understanding. It turns out Mom has a history of difficult behavior at events there. They were actually relieved to cancel rather than deal with another challenging situation. The revelation that Victoria's behavior problems extended beyond family relationships was both surprising and somehow validating. It confirmed that her actions today weren't just about me or my family's traditions. They were part of a broader pattern of entitled, destructive behavior." "What about the financial aspects?" I asked, thinking about the money that had been spent on reception preparations. "The venue is refunding the deposit in full, and they've offered to host a rescheduled celebration at no additional charge once we're ready to plan something more appropriate," James replied. They said they consider it their contribution to supporting military families. The kindness of strangers in contrast to Victoria's cruelty was almost overwhelming. People who barely knew us were willing to go out of their way to help, while the woman who was supposed to be family had deliberately chosen to cause maximum emotional damage. Ryan had been quiet during much of this discussion, clearly processing the full scope of his mother's manipulations and their impact on his own life. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with a combination of anger and sadness. "I need to call Michelle," he said. "She deserves to know what really happened, and I owe her an apology for not seeing through Mom's interference at the time." "That might be a good idea," James agreed. "But Ryan, you should also prepare yourself for the possibility that too much time has passed. People move on, build new lives. Michelle might not be interested in revisiting old relationships, even if she understands that Mom manipulated the situation." "I know," Ryan replied. "But she still deserves the truth, and I still owe her an apology. Whatever happens after that is up to her." I found myself admiring Ryan's willingness to face the consequences of his mother's actions, even when those consequences might be painful for him personally. It showed a maturity and integrity that Victoria had clearly failed to instill in her sons despite her claims of superior moral authority. "What about today's ceremony?" Lisa asked, bringing us back to the immediate practical concerns. "Are we still planning to proceed with the christening this afternoon?" James checked his watch and nodded. "Father Martinez is expecting us at 2 o'clock, and I see no reason to let Mom's behavior disrupt Sophia's christening any further than it already has. We'll use the simple white gown, and we'll focus on what the ceremony is really about, welcoming our daughter into the faith community and celebrating her place in our family." I looked down at Sophia, who had fallen asleep in my arms, her tiny face peaceful and trusting. The destruction of the heirloom gown had been devastating, but James was right. The ceremony wasn't about elaborate clothing or social status. It was about faith, family, and community, values that Victoria's behavior had actually served to clarify rather than diminish. "I think that's exactly what we should do," I agreed. "And I think my great-grandmother would approve. She was a practical woman who valued substance over appearance. She would have said that what matters is the love and intention behind the ceremony, not the grandeur of the presentation." James smiled at that, the first genuine smile I had seen from him since the morning's crisis began. "Then that's what we'll do. And afterward, we'll come back here for a simple family celebration with the people who actually matter to us." As we began to prepare for the rescheduled ceremony, I found myself thinking about the lessons Sophia would learn from this day. She would grow up knowing that her father was a man who stood up for his family when it mattered, that her uncle was someone willing to confront uncomfortable truths about his own mother, and that her godmother was a woman who had earned respect through courage and service rather than social status. Most importantly, she would learn that real family wasn't about maintaining appearances or meeting someone else's standards of acceptability. Real family was about love, loyalty, and mutual respect, qualities that could never be cut apart with scissors or destroyed by someone else's cruelty. The clock on the mantel chimed noon, reminding us that we had 2 hours to prepare for the ceremony. As we dispersed to get ready, I caught James's arm and pulled him aside for a private moment. "Are you sure about cutting your mother off like this?" I asked quietly. "I don't want you to have regrets later, or to feel like I forced you to choose between us." James cupped my face in his hands, his expression gentle but resolute. "Natalie, what Mom did today crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. She destroyed something irreplaceable because she wanted to hurt you and assert her dominance. That's not the behavior of someone who loves her family. That's the behavior of someone who sees family as possessions to be controlled." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "I've spent years making excuses for her behavior, telling myself that she was just protective or old-fashioned or dealing with grief from Dad's death. But watching her stand there with those scissors in her hand, seeing the satisfaction on her face when she looked at the destruction she had caused, that wasn't grief or protection. That was calculated cruelty." The pain in his voice was evident, and I realized that Victoria's actions had hurt James almost as much as they had hurt me. She had forced him to see her clearly for perhaps the first time in his adult life, and the reality of what he saw was devastating. "She'll have opportunities to make amends," James continued. "The door isn't permanently closed, but she'll have to demonstrate genuine remorse and make concrete changes to her behavior. And until that happens, I won't expose you or Sophia to her toxicity." I nodded, understanding that this decision was as difficult for James as it was necessary. Victoria had raised him, supported his career, and been a central figure in his life for over 30 years. Cutting her off wasn't a decision he was making lightly or out of anger. It was a decision he was making out of love for his wife and daughter, and out of a recognition that some behaviors simply couldn't be tolerated, regardless of the source. As I went to prepare for the ceremony, I found myself thinking about the irony of Victoria's position. She had spent so much energy trying to control her son's relationships and maintain her influence over their lives that she had ultimately driven them both away. Her obsession with social status and family image had led her to destroy the very relationships she claimed to be protecting. The simple white gown that Sophia would wear to her christening wouldn't carry the weight of family history that the heirloom gown had represented. But it would carry something else: the love of parents who were willing to stand up for their principles, the support of friends who valued character over status, and the blessing of a faith community that welcomed all children, regardless of their family's social standing. In trying to diminish my family's legacy, Victoria had actually succeeded in clarifying what really mattered. And as I prepared to take my daughter to be christened, I realized that Sophia was inheriting something far more valuable than an antique gown. She was inheriting parents who would protect her, defend her, and love her unconditionally, qualities that no amount of social status or family pedigree could ever replace. The chapel at Fort Belmont had witnessed countless ceremonies over the decades, from weddings to memorial services, but the atmosphere that afternoon felt particularly charged with significance. Father Martinez had served as chaplain for 12 years, and his weathered face carried the wisdom of someone who had counseled military families through their most challenging moments. When James had called to explain the morning's events, the chaplain had listened without judgment and adjusted his planned remarks accordingly. Sophia looked angelic in her simple white cotton gown, the fabric soft against her skin and free from the weight of complicated family politics. As I carried her up the steps to the chapel, I realized that this simpler approach actually felt more appropriate than the elaborate ceremony Victoria had envisioned. There was something pure about focusing solely on the spiritual significance of the moment without the distraction of social performance. The guest list had shrunk dramatically after the morning's events, but the people who remained represented the core of what really mattered to us. Lisa sat in the front pew wearing her dress uniform, the ribbons on her chest, telling the story of service and sacrifice that Victoria had dismissed so casually. Ryan flanked the other side, his expression solemn but supportive. Behind them sat a small group of James's colleagues from the Pentagon, officers who had known him for years and respected both his professional judgment and personal character. Colonel Patricia Hayes had surprised us by attending personally, despite the short notice. Her presence sent a clear message about the military community's response to Victoria's behavior, and I could see James's appreciation for her gesture of support. The colonel was known for her direct communication style and unwavering ethical standards, qualities that had earned her respect throughout the Pentagon hierarchy. As Father Martinez began the ceremony, I found myself thinking about my great-grandmother Margaret and the courage that had defined her generation of military wives. She had raised children while her husband served overseas, dealt with rationing and uncertainty during wartime, and maintained her faith through circumstances far more challenging than anything I had faced. The gown she had worn to her own children's christenings was gone, but the strength and resilience she had demonstrated lived on in different ways. James stood beside me with military bearing, but I could see the emotion in his eyes as Father Martinez spoke about the responsibilities of parenthood and the importance of raising children with strong moral foundations. The morning's confrontation with his mother had forced him to examine his own values and priorities in ways that were clearly still processing. In baptism, Father Martinez said, his voice carrying easily through the small chapel, "We welcome this child into a community of faith that transcends earthly divisions of rank, status, or social position. Before God, we are all equal in our need for grace and our capacity for love. The words seemed particularly meaningful given the morning's events, and I saw several people in the congregation nod in quiet agreement. The chaplain had a gift for finding universal truths that spoke to immediate circumstances without being heavy-handed or preachy. When it came time for the actual baptism, Father Martinez took Sophia gently in his arms and carried her to the font. She remained remarkably calm throughout the process, as if she understood the solemnity of the moment. As the holy water touched her forehead, I felt a profound sense of connection to something larger than family politics or social expectations. Sophia Marie Brooks, Father Martinez proclaimed, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The simplicity and beauty of the moment brought tears to my eyes, and I realized that Victoria's destructive actions had inadvertently cleared away all the superficial concerns that might have distracted from the ceremony's true meaning. There were no elaborate decorations to maintain, no social protocols to navigate, no complex family dynamics to manage. There was just love, faith, and the promise of community support for our daughter's spiritual journey. After the ceremony concluded, our small group gathered outside the chapel for photographs. The late afternoon sunlight created a warm golden glow that seemed to bless the occasion, and Sophia remained contentedly awake for the pictures that would commemorate this important day. As we posed for family photos, I noticed James's phone buzzing repeatedly with incoming messages, but he ignored them completely, focusing entirely on the celebration at hand. Colonel Hayes approached us as we were finishing the photos, her expression warm but serious. Congratulations on a beautiful ceremony, she said, extending her hand to both James and me. And I wanted you to know that the preliminary review of Mrs. Sterling's base access has been completed. There will be some changes to her privileges effective immediately. James nodded grimly. I appreciate your quick response, ma'am. The pattern of behavior needed to be addressed before it escalated further. Agreed, Colonel Hayes replied. We've also flagged similar incidents involving other military families for review. It appears this wasn't an isolated situation, and we take seriously any behavior that undermines the welfare of our service members and their families. The implication that Victoria's manipulative behavior had affected other military families beyond our own was both shocking and somehow validating. It confirmed that James's decision to involve official channels wasn't an overreaction, but a necessary response to a pattern of harmful conduct. As we prepared to leave the chapel, Ryan pulled me aside for a private conversation. His face was still pale from the morning's revelations, but there was a new determination in his expression that I hadn't seen before. I wanted you to know that I called Michelle this afternoon, he said quietly. She's living in Seattle now, working as a pediatric nurse. When I explained what Mom had done with the graduate school offer, she started crying. I felt my heart clench with sympathy for both Ryan and Michelle. How is she doing? Better than I expected, actually, Ryan replied. She's engaged to a doctor she met during her residency, and they seem very happy together. But she said she spent years wondering if she had made the right choice, if she had thrown away something real for the sake of career advancement. The lasting damage of Victoria's manipulation was evident in Ryan's voice. Even when her interference didn't permanently destroy relationships, it left people questioning their own judgment and wondering about paths not taken. Did you tell her the truth about Mom's involvement? I asked. Ryan nodded. Everything I could piece together. She wasn't entirely surprised, actually. She said she had always felt like Mom was testing her somehow, asking probing questions about her family background and future plans. But she was young and intimidated, and when the graduate school opportunity came with Mom's endorsement, she felt like she couldn't refuse without seeming ungrateful. The sophistication of Victoria's manipulation was breathtaking. She had identified a young woman's financial vulnerabilities and career ambitions, then used them as leverage to achieve her desired outcome while making her victim feel grateful for the opportunity. It was psychological manipulation on a level that bordered on predatory. How did she react when you apologized? I asked. She was gracious about it, said she understood that I couldn't have known what Mom was doing behind the scenes, Ryan replied. but I could hear the sadness in her voice. Not just about our relationship, but about the way Mom's interference made her doubt her own instincts and decision-making abilities. The conversation was interrupted by James approaching with Sophia, who had begun to show signs of needing a diaper change and feeding. As we prepared to head home for the family gathering, I noticed that James's phone had continued buzzing with messages throughout our conversation. "Is everything all right?" I asked, gesturing toward his phone. James's expression tightened slightly. "Mom has been trying to reach me ever since the Colonel's office contacted her about the base access review. She's apparently quite upset about the restrictions and wants to discuss the situation. Are you going to call her back?" "Not today," James replied firmly. "Today is about celebrating Sophia's christening with the people who actually care about our family's well-being. Mom made her choice this morning when she destroyed the gown. She'll have to live with the consequences of that choice." As we drove back to our quarters, I found myself reflecting on the dramatic shift in family dynamics that had occurred in just a few hours. Victoria had held a position of influence and control within the Sterling family for years, using emotional manipulation and social pressure to maintain her dominance over her sons' lives. But her escalation to outright destruction of family property had finally crossed a line that even her most loyal supporters couldn't ignore. The gathering at our home was intimate and meaningful in ways that Victoria's elaborate reception never could have been. Lisa helped me prepare simple refreshments while Ryan entertained Sophia with gentle conversation and silly faces that made her gurgle with infant delight. James made his famous grilled cheese sandwiches, a comfort food tradition from his own childhood that he had shared with me during our early dating days. Colonel Hayes had accepted our invitation to join the celebration, and her presence added a sense of official recognition to the day's events. As we sat around our living room sharing stories and laughter, I realized that this was what real family gatherings should feel like: relaxed, authentic, and focused on genuine connection rather than social performance. "You know," Colonel Hayes said as she prepared to leave, "in my 25 years of military service, I've seen many families struggle with the balance between military tradition and personal values. What happened today with Mrs. Sterling represents one of the more egregious examples of someone using military social connections for personal manipulation." She paused, looking directly at James with the expression of a superior officer delivering important guidance. "Your response has been measured and appropriate. The military community values leaders who can distinguish between family loyalty and enabling harmful behavior. Your willingness to set clear boundaries protects not just your immediate family, but potentially other families who might have been targeted by similar manipulation." The validation from such a respected senior officer clearly meant a great deal to James, and I could see some of the tension leave his shoulders as Colonel Hayes spoke. The decision to involve official channels and restrict his mother's access had been difficult, but it was being recognized as necessary and appropriate by his professional peers. After Colonel Hayes left, the four of us spent the evening in quiet companionship. Sophia had her evening feeding and then settled into peaceful sleep, apparently unaffected by the day's earlier drama. Ryan called Michelle again to share some photos from the christening ceremony, and I could hear the warmth in both their voices as they talked about their respective lives and relationships. As the evening wore on, James's phone continued to buzz with messages from Victoria, but he steadfastly ignored them. At one point, the house phone rang with a call from Victoria's number, but James simply turned off the ringer and let it go to voicemail. "She's going to keep trying," I observed as we watched the voicemail light blink on our answering machine. "Let her," James replied with quiet determination. "She needs to understand that her actions have consequences, and that those consequences won't be resolved with a phone call or a superficial apology. If she wants to rebuild any kind of relationship with this family, she's going to have to demonstrate genuine change in her behavior." Later that evening, after Ryan and Lisa had returned to their respective accommodations, James and I finally had a chance to process the day's events privately. We sat together on our couch, Sophia sleeping peacefully in her bassinet nearby, and talked through everything that had happened since that morning's devastating discovery. "I keep thinking about what Colonel Hayes said," James mused, "about the need to distinguish between family loyalty and enabling harmful behavior. I spent so many years making excuses for Mom's conduct, telling myself that she was just protective or dealing with grief from Dad's death." He paused, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized as his way of processing difficult emotions. But protective behavior doesn't involve destroying other people's family heirlooms. Grief doesn't justify years of manipulating your children's relationships. At some point, you have to acknowledge that the behavior is the problem, not the circumstances surrounding it. I reached over and took his hand, feeling the calluses from years of military training and the wedding ring that symbolized his commitment to our family. It takes courage to see someone you love clearly, especially when what you see is painful. But you did the right thing today, both for us and for your mother. Enabling her behavior would have just made it worse over time. James squeezed my hand gently. I keep wondering what Dad would have thought about all this. He was such a straightforward man, believed in treating people with respect regardless of their background or social status. I think he would have been horrified by what Mom did today. The mention of James's father brought back memories of the stories James had shared about him over the years. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sterling had been killed in a training accident when James was 12, leaving Victoria to raise 2 young boys while dealing with her own grief and the practical challenges of military widowhood. By all accounts, he had been a man of integrity and honor who had instilled strong values in his sons during his too brief time with them. Maybe that's part of why this is so painful, I suggested. You're not just dealing with your mother's behavior, but with the knowledge that it contradicts everything your father stood for. James nodded slowly. Dad always said that character is revealed under pressure, and that how you treat people when you think no one is watching tells you everything you need to know about someone's true nature. Mom thought she could destroy the gown and manipulate the situation to her advantage because she assumed I would side with her over you. The insight was both accurate and heartbreaking. Victoria had calculated that James's loyalty to her would override his commitment to his wife and daughter, a miscalculation that revealed how poorly she understood the man her son had become. As we prepared for bed that night, I found myself thinking about the christening ceremony and the words Father Martinez had spoken about welcoming Sophia into a community of faith. The morning had begun with the destruction of one tradition, but the day had ended with the affirmation of values that ran much deeper than fabric and pearls. Sophia would grow up knowing that her parents had faced a family crisis with integrity and courage. She would learn that real strength sometimes means setting boundaries with people you love, and that protecting your family's values is more important than maintaining social harmony. Most importantly, she would understand that her worth as a person had nothing to do with social status or family pedigree, but everything to do with the love and respect she gave and received from others. The last message James received from Victoria that night came as a text rather than a phone call. He read it silently, his expression growing increasingly grim, then handed me the phone to read. James, I don't understand why you're overreacting to what was clearly a misunderstanding. I was trying to help by providing a more appropriate gown for Sophia's christening. Your father would be ashamed of how you're treating your mother over such a trivial matter. Call me so we can resolve this like adults. The text revealed so much about Victoria's mindset and her inability to comprehend the true nature of her actions. She still viewed the destruction of the heirloom gown as a misunderstanding, rather than a deliberate act of cruelty. She was invoking James's father's memory as emotional manipulation, and she was characterizing James's measured response as an overreaction to a trivial matter. She still doesn't get it, I said, handing the phone back to James. No, she doesn't, he agreed. And until she does, there's nothing to discuss. She can't resolve a problem she refuses to acknowledge exists. James turned off his phone for the night, and we went to bed knowing that the family crisis was far from over. Victoria's text made it clear that she had no intention of accepting responsibility for her actions or acknowledging the pain she had caused. The battle lines had been drawn, and the coming days would test everyone's resolve to maintain the boundaries that had been established. But as I lay in bed listening to Sophia's peaceful breathing and feeling James's steady presence beside me, I felt a sense of calm that had been absent during the months of mounting tension with Victoria. The worst had happened, the lines had been drawn, and we had emerged with our values and relationships intact. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together as a family, united by love and mutual respect, rather than divided by manipulation and control. The christening gown was gone forever, but the legacy it represented, courage, service, and unwavering commitment to family lived on in the choices we had made and would continue to make in the days ahead. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually energized me for the week ahead, but this particular morning carried an undercurrent of tension that coffee couldn't quite dispel. James had left for the Pentagon earlier than usual, his goodbye kiss lingering longer than normal as if he were steeling himself for whatever the day might bring. Sophia had slept well through the night, blissfully unaware that her grandmother's actions 2 days prior had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape our family permanently. I was in the kitchen preparing my second cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a delivery truck and a uniformed courier holding what appeared to be a substantial package. The return address made my stomach clench: Sterling Manor, Richmond, Virginia. The package was addressed to me personally, with Victoria's elaborate script making my name look like calligraphy on expensive wedding invitations. Inside the carefully wrapped box, I found the Sterling family christening gown that Victoria had mentioned during her destructive rampage. It was indeed elaborate, with layers of Belgian lace and seed pearls that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Beneath the gown lay a handwritten note on Victoria's personal stationery. "My dear Natalie," the note began in her distinctive flowing handwriting, "I thought you might reconsider using the family gown for a photographer's session with little Sophia. The images would be lovely for Christmas cards, and it would help establish her proper place in the Sterling lineage. I'm sure once you see the gown's magnificence, you'll understand why I felt the other option was unsuitable. Perhaps we can put this unfortunate misunderstanding behind us and focus on what's truly important, presenting our family in the best possible light." The audacity of the gesture was breathtaking. Victoria was attempting to rewrite the narrative of what had happened, transforming her destructive act into a reasonable suggestion that I had simply misunderstood. She was offering me the Sterling gown as if it were a generous gift, rather than an attempt to replace something irreplaceable she had deliberately destroyed. More disturbing was her use of the phrase, "unfortunate misunderstanding." Victoria wasn't just refusing to acknowledge the cruelty of her actions, she was actively attempting to gaslight me into believing that my perception of events was incorrect. According to her version of reality, she had simply made a practical suggestion about christening attire, and my emotional response was the real problem. I was still staring at the note when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Victoria's number, and I found myself caught between curiosity about what she might say and reluctance to engage with her manipulation tactics. After 4 rings, I answered with a carefully neutral tone. "Hello, Victoria?" "Natalie, darling." Victoria's voice came through with syrupy sweetness that immediately put me on guard. "I hope you received my little package this morning. I wanted to reach out personally to see if we might arrange a time to talk through this weekend's events like civilized adults." The phrase civilized adults was loaded with implication. That my response to her actions had been uncivilized, that refusing to accept her behavior was somehow immature or unreasonable. "I received the gown," I replied evenly, "along with your note." "Wonderful. I thought perhaps you could bring Sophia over to the house this afternoon for a proper photo session. I've already contacted the photographer who did the Sterling family portraits last year, and she's available on short notice. We could create some beautiful images that would be perfect for announcements." The suggestion was presented as if nothing had happened, as if the destruction of my family's heirloom was a minor speed bump that could be overcome with the right PR approach. Victoria was attempting to move directly to damage control without ever acknowledging that damage had occurred. "Victoria," I said slowly, "you destroyed my great-grandmother's christening gown. You cut it into pieces with scissors because you didn't think it was good enough for your family's image. That wasn't a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. It was a deliberate act of destruction." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh that somehow managed to convey both patience and condescension. "Natalie, I understand that you're upset, but I think you're being rather dramatic about the whole situation. It was an old piece of fabric, dear. Sentimental, perhaps, but hardly irreplaceable. The Sterling gown is a genuine heirloom, with documented historical significance. Surely you can see that using it would be better for Sophia's future." The casual dismissal of my family's history as an old piece of fabric revealed everything I needed to know about Victoria's mindset. She genuinely believed that her family's traditions were inherently more valuable than mine, not because of any objective measure of historical significance, but simply because they belonged to the Sterling name. The gown you destroyed connected Sophia to 4 generations of military service, I replied, my voice growing stronger as I spoke. It represented courage, sacrifice, and a tradition of serving something larger than yourself. Those aren't values that can be replaced with Belgian lace and seed pearls. Oh, Natalie, Victoria's voice took on a tone I might use with a child who was refusing to understand a simple concept. You're being unnecessarily sentimental. Military service is admirable, of course, but the Sterling family has a different kind of legacy to maintain. We move in circles where appearance and proper presentation matter enormously for career advancement and social positioning. The mask was slipping now, revealing the calculation behind Victoria's actions. She wasn't just dismissing my family's military service. She was arguing that social positioning was more important than actual service to country. In her worldview, networking at the right parties trumped valor in combat zones. James's career has advanced because of his competence and leadership, not because of what christening gown his daughter wears, I said firmly. You'd be surprised how much these social considerations matter at higher levels, Victoria replied, with the confidence of someone who believed she understood power dynamics better than anyone else. The right connections, the proper introductions, the ability to fit seamlessly into established social networks. These things make the difference between promotion and stagnation. The conversation was revealing Victoria's fundamental misunderstanding of her son's character and career trajectory. James had earned his position through merit, not social maneuvering, and he would be insulted by any suggestion that his success depended on his family's ability to impress the right people at social gatherings. Victoria, I'm not going to continue this conversation, I said, my patience finally exhausted. What you did was wrong, and your refusal to acknowledge that fact tells me everything I need to know about your character. I'll be returning the Sterling gown by courier this afternoon. Natalie, wait, Victoria's voice sharpened with alarm. You're making a mistake that you'll regret. James may be angry now, but he'll come to his senses once he realizes what you're throwing away. The Sterling family has influence that extends far beyond military circles. You're jeopardizing not just your social position but Sophia's future opportunities. The threat was barely veiled now. Victoria was suggesting that my refusal to capitulate would have consequences for both my marriage and my daughter's prospects. She was positioning herself as a gatekeeper to opportunities that I would be foolish to alienate. Goodbye, Victoria, I said, and hung up before she could respond. I sat in my kitchen for several minutes after ending the call, processing both the conversation and the implications of Victoria's continued refusal to accept responsibility for her actions. She was doubling down on her position, apparently believing that social pressure and implied threats would force me to back down and accept her version of events. The phone rang again almost immediately, but this time the caller ID showed James's office number. When I answered, his voice carried the crisp efficiency I recognized from his professional communications. Natalie, I just received an interesting call from Colonel Hayes. Apparently, Mom contacted the base commander's office this morning to complain about what she called harassment related to her access privileges. She's claiming that the restrictions placed on her base access are retaliation for a family disagreement. The escalation was breathtaking in its audacity. Victoria wasn't content to manipulate our personal relationship. She was now attempting to involve James's commanding officers in what she was characterizing as a petty family squabble. What did Colonel Hayes tell you? I asked. That Mom's complaint has been forwarded to the Inspector General's office for formal review, which means there will now be an official investigation into the circumstances surrounding her restricted access. Mom apparently thought that complaining to higher authorities would force them to reverse the decision. Instead, she's triggered a more comprehensive examination of her conduct. I could hear the mixture of frustration and grim satisfaction in James's voice. Victoria's attempt to circumvent the consequences of her actions had backfired spectacularly, escalating the situation to a level where her behavior would be scrutinized by officials who had no personal relationship with the Sterling family. How serious is an Inspector General investigation? I asked, though I suspected the answer would not be reassuring. Very serious, James replied. The IG's office investigates allegations of misconduct, abuse of authority, and violations of military standards. They have broad investigative powers and can interview anyone they deem relevant to the case. Mom's complaint about harassment means they'll be looking at the entire pattern of her behavior, not just the specific incident that triggered the access restrictions. The irony was perfect. Victoria's attempt to portray herself as the victim of harassment had instead opened her conduct to the kind of official scrutiny that would expose the full scope of her manipulative behavior over the years. "Will this affect your career?" I asked, voicing the concern that was already forming in my mind. "It shouldn't, assuming the investigation confirms what we already know about Mom's conduct," James replied. "If anything, it might reflect well on my judgment that I reported the situation through proper channels rather than trying to handle it privately. The military values leaders who put institutional integrity ahead of personal relationships." After ending the call with James, I spent the afternoon researching Inspector General procedures and trying to understand what the formal investigation might involve. The IG's office website explained that investigations typically included interviews with all relevant parties, review of documentary evidence, and examination of any patterns of behavior that might indicate systemic problems. I was in the middle of this research when Ryan called, his voice tight with stress and barely controlled anger. "Natalie, I need to warn you about something," he said without preamble. "Mom just called me, and she's planning to escalate this situation in ways that could get really ugly really fast." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would be disturbing. "She's hired a private investigator to look into your background," Ryan said bluntly. "She's convinced that there must be something in your family history or personal conduct that would justify her actions if it came to light. She thinks she can find evidence that you're not suitable for the Sterling family and use it to force James to choose between you and her." The violation of privacy was shocking enough, but the underlying assumption was even more disturbing. Victoria was so convinced of her own righteousness that she believed investigation would vindicate her position and reveal me to be the real problem in our family dynamic. "Did she tell you what specifically she's looking for?" I asked. "Financial irregularities, previous relationships, anything about your family's military service records that might be embarrassing or problematic," Ryan replied. "She's particularly interested in finding out if there were any disciplinary actions or court-martial proceedings in your family's service history." The desperation behind Victoria's actions was becoming clearer. She was so committed to maintaining her position as family matriarch that she was willing to violate basic privacy and trust to find ammunition against her daughter-in-law. She was treating our family conflict like a military campaign, complete with intelligence gathering and strategic planning. "Ryan, I appreciate you warning me about this," I said. "But I have to ask, why are you telling me?" "She's your mother, and you're essentially betraying her confidence." Ryan was quiet for a moment before responding, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of sadness that spoke to the difficulty of his position. "Because what she's doing is wrong, Natalie. I've spent the last 2 days thinking about all the relationships she's interfered with over the years, all the ways she's manipulated situations to maintain control. I can't be part of that anymore, even if it means going against my own mother." The courage it must have taken Ryan to make that call and warn me about Victoria's escalating tactics was enormous. He was choosing to stand with what was right rather than what was easy, even when it meant betraying his mother's confidence and potentially damaging their relationship beyond repair. "What will you tell her if she asks whether you warned me?" I asked. "The truth," Ryan replied simply, "that I believe her actions are wrong and that I won't be complicit in them. She raised me to have integrity, and I'm choosing to honor that value even when it means opposing her." That evening, when James returned from the Pentagon, I briefed him on both Victoria's phone call and Ryan's warning about the private investigator. His reaction was swift and decisive, in a way that reminded me why he had been successful in military leadership roles. "Mom hiring a private investigator crosses a line from family conflict into active hostility," he said, his voice carrying the cold precision I recognized from his professional briefings. "If she wants to treat this like warfare, she needs to understand that I have resources and connections that dwarf anything she can bring to bear." James disappeared into his study for over an hour, making phone calls and reviewing documents with the methodical approach he brought to complex military operations. When he emerged, his expression was grim but determined. "I've spoken with our attorney about obtaining a restraining order if Mom's harassment escalates further," he said. "I've also contacted a security firm that specializes in protecting military families from various threats. If she wants to hire investigators, we'll hire counter-surveillance specialists." The escalation was both necessary and deeply sad. What had begun as a family disagreement about a christening gown was morphing into something resembling a covert operations conflict, complete with professional investigators and security consultants. "How did it come to this?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I expected James to have an answer. "Mom has spent so many years believing that manipulation and control were acceptable tools for maintaining her position, that she doesn't know how to function when those tools stop working," James replied. "She's escalating because she can't conceive of a reality where her will doesn't ultimately prevail." That night, as we prepared for bed, James received a text message that made him stop mid-motion while brushing his teeth. He read it twice, then handed me the phone with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. The message was from Victoria, sent at 10:47 p.m. "James, I've received some disturbing information about Natalie's family background that I think you should know about before this situation goes any further. I'm trying to protect our family's reputation and Sophia's future. Please call me so we can discuss this privately." The vagueness of the threat was clearly intentional, designed to create anxiety and uncertainty about what Victoria might have discovered or fabricated. She was attempting to leverage James's protective instincts by suggesting that Sophia's future was somehow at stake. "She's bluffing," I said, though I couldn't entirely suppress a flutter of anxiety about what a private investigator might have found or misinterpreted about my family's history. "Of course she's bluffing," James agreed. "But the fact that she's attempting this kind of manipulation tells me that she's becoming increasingly desperate. Desperate people sometimes do unpredictable things." As we lay in bed that night, I found myself thinking about the trajectory of events since Saturday morning. Victoria's destruction of the christening gown had been the opening salvo in what was becoming a comprehensive campaign to reassert her control over our family dynamics. Each escalation on her part had been met with measured but firm responses from James, creating a spiral of conflict that seemed unlikely to resolve itself peacefully. The Inspector General investigation would proceed according to its own timeline, potentially taking weeks or months to reach conclusions about Victoria's conduct. The private investigator she had hired would presumably begin digging into my background, looking for vulnerabilities or embarrassing information that could be weaponized against our marriage. Meanwhile, our actual life continued with its normal rhythms. Sophia needed feeding and diaper changes and gentle attention that had nothing to do with family politics or social maneuvering. The military community at Fort Belmont provided its usual support and camaraderie, creating a sense of normalcy that stood in stark contrast to Victoria's melodramatic escalations. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized that Victoria's campaign to destroy my place in the Sterling family was having the opposite effect of what she intended. Instead of driving a wedge between James and me, her actions were strengthening our partnership and clarifying our shared values. Every escalation on her part demonstrated more clearly why boundaries were necessary, and why protecting our immediate family had to take precedence over maintaining peace with extended relatives. The war Victoria had declared would continue, but she had fundamentally miscalculated both the battlefield and her opponent's capabilities. What she saw as a young woman who could be intimidated and controlled, James saw as the strong, principled partner he had chosen to build a life with. What she viewed as a minor family squabble that could be managed through traditional manipulation, the military community recognized as serious misconduct that warranted official intervention. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and probably new escalations. But tonight I slept peacefully, knowing that we were standing on the right side of a conflict we had never wanted but would not shy away from. 3 weeks after Victoria's escalating campaign began, the morning that would change everything started with an unexpected visitor at our door. I was feeding Sophia her breakfast when I heard the distinctive sound of multiple vehicles pulling into our driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could see 2 official military sedans and what appeared to be a civilian vehicle with government plates. James emerged from his study before I could even process what was happening, his expression alert but unsurprised. "That'll be the Inspector General's team," he said, adjusting his uniform jacket with the precision of someone preparing for an important briefing. "They called last night to schedule this morning's interview session." The lead investigator introduced herself as Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Martinez, a woman whose bearing and direct communication style immediately commanded respect. She was accompanied by a civilian legal specialist and a senior sergeant who served as the team's documentation specialist. Their professional demeanor made it clear that this was far from a routine administrative review. "Colonel Brooks, Mrs. Brooks," Lieutenant Colonel Martinez said as we gathered in our living room, "we appreciate your cooperation with this investigation. I want to assure you that our review has been thorough and comprehensive, involving multiple interviews and extensive documentation analysis." She opened a thick file folder that contained what appeared to be dozens of witness statements, documentary evidence, and official correspondence. The scope of their investigation had clearly expanded far beyond the immediate circumstances surrounding Victoria's restricted base access. "Before we discuss our findings," Lieutenant Colonel Martinez continued, "I need to inform you that this investigation has uncovered a pattern of conduct that extends significantly beyond the initial complaint filed by Mrs. Victoria Sterling. We've identified at least 7 military families who have been affected by similar manipulative behavior over the past 5 years. The revelation was staggering. Victoria's interference in our family relationships wasn't an isolated incident, or even a pattern limited to her immediate family. She had been systematically manipulating military families across multiple bases and social networks, using her connections and social standing to gather information and apply pressure in ways that violated military community standards. The families affected include those of active duty officers, NCOs, and civilian contractors working with military installations, the investigator explained. Mrs. Sterling's methods appear to have been consistent. She would identify relationships or family dynamics she viewed as problematic, then use a combination of social pressure, financial incentives, and strategic information sharing to achieve desired outcomes. James's face had grown increasingly grave as Lieutenant Colonel Martinez outlined the scope of Victoria's manipulative network. "Are you saying that my mother has been conducting systematic interference operations against military families for years?" "That's essentially correct," Martinez replied. "Her activities included background investigations on family members, strategic disclosure of personal information to create social pressure, and coordination with civilian social networks to isolate targets from community support systems." I felt a chill run down my spine as the full implications of what we were hearing began to sink in. Victoria hadn't just been a difficult mother-in-law, she had been operating what amounted to a personal intelligence network designed to control and manipulate military families according to her social preferences. "The investigation was triggered by your mother's complaint about harassment," Martinez continued. "But once we began reviewing her activities, multiple other families came forward with similar experiences. The pattern was so consistent and systematic that we've classified this as a case involving potential violations of federal regulations regarding interference with military personnel." The legal specialist, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Chen, leaned forward to address the next phase of their findings. Mrs. Sterling's hiring of a private investigator to conduct background research on Mrs. Brooks represents an escalation that crosses into potentially criminal territory. Using private investigators to gather intelligence on military family members without consent violates several federal statutes. James's expression had shifted into what I recognized as his command mode, the focused intensity he brought to 2 serious military situations. "What kind of criminal violations are we discussing?" "Harassment, invasion of privacy, and potentially conspiracy to interfere with military operations," Ms. Chen replied. "The private investigator she hired has been conducting surveillance activities that could be construed as threatening to base security and military family welfare." The scope of Victoria's misconduct was breathtaking in its audacity and potential legal consequences. She had escalated from personal manipulation to activities that could result in federal criminal charges, apparently believing that her social connections and family relationships would protect her from accountability. "There's more," Lieutenant Colonel Martinez said, opening another section of her file. "The private investigator Mrs. Sterling hired has connections to foreign intelligence services. While there's no evidence that Mrs. Sterling was aware of these connections, her hiring of this particular firm triggered additional security reviews by military intelligence." The implications were staggering. Victoria's desperate attempt to find damaging information about my background had inadvertently created a national security concern that was now being investigated by multiple federal agencies. The investigator she hired, Marcus Whitfield, has been under surveillance by the FBI for suspected activities involving the sale of personal information to foreign contacts, Ms. Chen explained. Mrs. Sterling's contract with his firm has been flagged as part of a broader investigation into potential security breaches affecting military personnel. James looked stunned. "You're telling me that my mother's vendetta against my wife has somehow intersected with a federal counterintelligence investigation?" "Unfortunately, yes," Martinez confirmed. Mr. Whitfield's firm specializes in gathering personal information on military families, which they then package and sell to various clients. Some of those clients have been identified as foreign intelligence operatives seeking information about U.S. military personnel and their vulnerabilities. I felt sick thinking about how Victoria's desire to destroy my reputation had potentially compromised the security of military families across the country. Her selfish vindictiveness had led her to hire investigators who were actively working against American national security interests. "What happens now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Several things will happen simultaneously," Lieutenant Colonel Martinez replied. "First, Mrs. Sterling will be formally banned from all military installations and events indefinitely. Second, her activities will be referred to federal prosecutors for potential criminal charges. Third, she'll be required to provide full cooperation with the ongoing counterintelligence investigation." The comprehensive nature of the consequences was both satisfying and overwhelming. Victoria's campaign to reassert control over our family had backfired so spectacularly that she was now facing federal criminal investigation and permanent exclusion from the military community she had used as her power base for decades. "There will also be protective measures implemented for your family," Ms. Chen added. "Given Mrs. Sterling's demonstrated willingness to escalate and her connections to potentially dangerous investigative services, we're recommending enhanced security protocols for your residence and daily activities." James nodded grimly. "What kind of security protocols?" "Base housing security will be increased, your communications will be monitored for potential threats, and you'll be provided with direct contact information for security personnel if Mrs. Sterling attempts any further harassment or intimidation," Martinez explained. The transformation of our quiet family life into something requiring federal security protection was surreal and deeply disturbing. Victoria's inability to accept the consequences of her actions had created ripple effects that extended far beyond family relationships into matters of national security and criminal law. When will Mrs. Sterling be notified of these findings? And word of Mrs. Sterling's situation has spread quickly through the Chaplain network. "How much do people know?" I asked, wondering about the scope of community awareness regarding the investigation. "Enough to understand that she engaged in systematic harassment of military families over an extended period," Father Martinez replied. "The Chaplain Corps has been asked to provide counseling support for affected families, and we're learning that her behavior has caused significant emotional damage across multiple bases." The revelation that Victoria's manipulation had been extensive enough to require chaplain intervention for multiple families was both validating and heartbreaking. It confirmed that our experience wasn't isolated while highlighting the broader damage her actions had caused. "I also wanted you to know," Father Martinez continued, "that several families have reached out specifically to express support for your decision to stand up to Mrs. Sterling's behavior. Many people were aware of her manipulative tendencies but felt powerless to challenge someone with her social connections and influence. The idea that other families had been suffering in silence under Victoria's manipulation while feeling unable to seek help was deeply disturbing. It suggested that her reign of social terrorism had been sustained partly by people's fear of challenging someone with apparent power and influence. 2 days later, the local newspaper ran a front-page story about Victoria's arrest and the broader investigation into her activities. The headline read, "Military Community Manipulation Network Exposed," and the article detailed how a single complaint about base access restrictions had uncovered years of systematic harassment targeting military families. The story included quotes from several affected families who described Victoria's methods of gathering personal information, applying social pressure, and coordinating with civilian networks to isolate and manipulate targets. The scope of her operations was presented in terms that made it clear this wasn't typical family conflict, but rather organized harassment with broader community impacts. James's name was mentioned in the article as the officer who had initially reported concerns about his mother's conduct, and he was quoted as saying, "Military families deserve to be protected from manipulation and harassment, regardless of the source." Standing up for what's right sometimes means making difficult decisions about people you love. The public nature of the story was both uncomfortable and necessary. Victoria's actions had affected too many people for the matter to be resolved quietly, and the military community needed to understand both the scope of her misconduct and the consequences that would follow. Victoria's criminal trial began 6 weeks later, attracting significant media attention due to the unusual nature of her crimes and their intersection with national security concerns. The prosecution presented evidence showing that she had maintained detailed files on dozens of military families, tracking personal information, relationship dynamics, and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited for manipulation purposes. The private investigator she had hired, Marcus Whitfield, had already pleaded guilty to charges related to selling personal information about military personnel to foreign contacts. His cooperation with prosecutors provided detailed evidence about Victoria's requests for information and her willingness to pay premium rates for comprehensive background investigations. During the trial, several military families testified about the impact of Victoria's manipulation on their relationships and careers. Michelle, Ryan's former girlfriend, flew in from Seattle to testify about how Victoria's graduate school offer had been used as leverage to break up her relationship with Ryan. Other witnesses described similar patterns of financial incentives, social pressure, and strategic information sharing designed to achieve Victoria's desired outcomes. The most damaging testimony came from military wives who had considered Victoria a friend and confidant, only to discover that she had been systematically gathering and sharing their personal information within her social network. The betrayal of trust was so comprehensive that several women described feeling unable to participate in military community activities for months after learning about Victoria's deception. James testified about the destruction of the christening gown and Victoria's escalating harassment campaign, presenting his decision to involve official channels as a necessary response to protect his family and potentially other military families from similar manipulation. His testimony was measured and professional, focusing on facts rather than emotions, while clearly establishing the pattern of Victoria's misconduct. When Victoria took the stand in her own defense, her testimony revealed the depth of her delusion about the appropriateness of her actions. She maintained that her information-gathering activities were normal social interaction, that her manipulation of relationships was protective guidance, and that the hiring of private investigators was reasonable due diligence for family security concerns. Her inability to accept responsibility for the harm she had caused was so complete that it actually strengthened the prosecution's case. Victoria's testimony demonstrated that she viewed other people as objects to be controlled rather than individuals with rights to privacy and autonomy, making it clear that her behavior was likely to continue without legal intervention. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including harassment, invasion of privacy, and conspiracy to interfere with military operations. The judge's sentencing remarks were particularly pointed, noting that Victoria had abused her position within the military community to cause systematic harm to families who deserved support rather than manipulation. Victoria was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, during which she would be prohibited from contacting any military installations or personnel. She was also ordered to pay restitution to affected families and to surrender all personal information she had gathered about military personnel over the years. The financial penalties were substantial, requiring Victoria to liquidate assets to meet her restitution obligations. The grand Richmond mansion that had been her symbol of social status was sold to cover legal fees and victim compensation, marking the complete collapse of the lifestyle and influence she had worked decades to maintain. Ryan ultimately received his requested transfer to a base in Colorado, where he could rebuild his military career without the constant reminder of his mother's misconduct. Before leaving Fort Belmont, he reconciled with Michelle, who had ended her engagement after learning the truth about how her relationship with Ryan had been manipulated. Their renewed relationship was cautious but genuine, built on a foundation of honesty that Victoria's interference had previously prevented. The broader military community implemented new protocols for identifying and addressing systematic harassment within social networks, using Victoria's case as an example of how manipulation could escalate into serious criminal conduct if left unchecked. The policies included better reporting mechanisms for families experiencing social pressure and clearer guidelines for appropriate behavior within military community organizations. 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, James received a promotion to Brigadier General, a recognition that surprised many people, but which Colonel Hayes explained as reflecting his principled leadership during a difficult situation. General Brooks demonstrated the courage to put institutional integrity ahead of personal relationships, she said during the promotion ceremony. That's exactly the kind of character we need in senior leadership positions. The promotion meant a transfer to the Pentagon full-time, requiring us to leave Fort Belmont for a new assignment in Fayua, the Washington area. As we packed our quarters, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed since that terrible morning when I had discovered Victoria destroying Sophia's christening gown. The gown itself had been memorialized in a shadow box created by a textile conservator, preserving some of the original fabric and pearls in a display that told the story of my family's military service. The piece now hung in Sophia's nursery, not as a functional garment but as a reminder of the courage and sacrifice that had defined previous generations of military wives. Sophia herself had grown from an infant unaware of family conflict into a toddler who babbled happily while playing with toys, blissfully ignorant of the dramatic events that had shaped her early months. She would grow up knowing that her parents had stood up for their principles when it mattered, that her father had chosen integrity over convenience, and that real family loyalty meant protecting rather than controlling the people you love. On our last evening at Fort Belmont, Lisa came for dinner to help us finish packing and say goodbye. As we sat on the porch watching Sophia play in the yard, Lisa raised her glass of wine in a toast. "To families that protect rather than control," she said with a smile. "And to friends who stand by each other when it matters most." James raised his glass as well. "To military traditions that honor service rather than status. And to the courage to defend what's really important." I thought about my great-grandmother Margaret as I joined the toast, imagining what she would think about the way her christening gown's destruction had ultimately led to protecting dozens of military families from manipulation and harassment. She had faced her own challenges with dignity and determination, and I hoped that our response to Victoria's cruelty had honored that legacy of strength and principle. The move to Washington represented a new chapter for our family, one that would be built on the solid foundation of trust and mutual respect that Victoria's actions had actually served to strengthen rather than weaken. Her campaign to control our relationships had failed completely, while our commitment to protecting each other had been tested and proven unbreakable. As we drove away from Fort Belmont the next morning, Sophia sleeping peacefully in her car seat and our household goods following behind in a military moving truck, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the way events had unfolded. Victoria's cruelty had been real and painful, but it had also revealed the strength of our marriage, the loyalty of true friends, and the supportive power of a military community that valued character over social status. The christening gown was gone forever, but the legacy it represented continued in the choices we made every day to honor service over selfishness, love over control, and integrity over convenience. Sophia would inherit that legacy not through fabric and pearls, but through the example of parents who had faced a family crisis with courage and emerged stronger for the experience. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.